I want to introduce you to someone who was the first person to inspire me about renewable energy. Stephen Mildenberger lives in Musherboom, a small community along Nova Scotia's east coast. His enthusiasm is contagious. He's an example of how we can all educate ourselves about energy conservation and find new ways to create and store energy. From net zero to hero, here's Stephen. Hi, Stephen, and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to chat again, Maria.
It's great to see you. So, I was telling in the intro, you were an early inspiration to me, with your passion and your interest in conservation and energy. And, you were one of the first people in the province to have a Tesla,
Yeah,
and you were
I
very
think our
royal.
friend Maggie got one ahead of me, but
Yeah,
I was one of the early adopters. That's
you
correct.
were definitely an early adopter. So going back further than that, how did you get interested in renewable energy?
Well, I think I've always had a little bit of interest. The place I'm living in, I had built 16 years ago and was looking at heat pumps and ways to make it more efficient at that time.
Hmm.
But it was kind of uh, didn't rank very high on my agenda of things I was interested in learning. But I've always been passionate about anything I run into that's new and different. And I think a podcast or a Zoom, I guess it was actually a YouTube thing by a futurist talking about uh, early adoption and adoption curves and how things are going to disrupt the world. And talked about EVs and talked about solar and talked about other energy. And that just caught my attention.
Hmm.
And from there, one thing led to another. And I started digging into and learning about some of this stuff. So, yeah. And then
Awesome.
that's from there, it's the rest is history.
How have you made the transition on a personal scale, to a smaller carbon footprint? Because you live in a small rural community, which
Yeah.
demonstrates that anybody, you don't have to live in a big city, to be it. But besides being one of the first Teslas, one of them in Eastern Canada, how else, have you done
Well,
this
I
one?
think the first thing I had to do was learn about what low carbon footprint meant. And that was a
Right.
challenge in itself. We start learning about things like scope one and scope two and scope three emissions and things that
Mhm.
the big companies talk about. So everything's learning, but first thing I realized is that you can't burn anything and keep a low carbon footprint. So my house is heated with electricity, not with oil, not with gas. Um, I have a backup stove that I use if the power's off and I need to keep the house warm in winter. But uh, burning puts carbon into the air, and so that was kind of my focus.
Mhm.
And that led me to first the home, then the car, then solar, and I've got a large solar array. Then
Right. You're
gradually,
one of the first, you were like the first large, what is it, two-axis
a
tracker? Is that?
two-axis tracker. Yeah, it's a 90 solar panel, 35 kilowatt for anybody who understands that sort of stuff.
Yes.
A two-axis tracker, and it follows the sun in two axes and tracks from day to night, and gives me about 40% more electricity than fixed panels would give me for the same number of panels. So
Excellent.
that was not necessary. Well, it was necessary because I wanted to be able to offset all of my electricity, including heating my house, including charging my Tesla. And it would have otherwise meant stripping a lot of trees off my property to make space for ground mount solar panels because my roof didn't have enough space. So that's what led me to the tracker. And then once I had the tracker, I said, okay, what else am I doing? Well, I'm using a gas lawnmower. So now I have a Husqvarna robo mower, auto mower, they call it,
Right.
to cut my grass, and those sort of things. And
Yeah.
the only thing I buy gas for now is my boat, and that's my next project is to get an electric outboard motor on my boat. So
Excellent.
yeah, you've got to think, where do you burn something, and wherever you burn something, and it's usually wood or oil or gas, convert it to electricity. That's really what the world is about. in terms of
Exactly.
getting to net zero.
And just to explain to people who may not be aware, what is a two-axis tracker? You were saying.
Two-axis tracker means that when the sun comes up, it tilts, uh, say east to west. It'll point to the east wherever the sun is, and it'll tilt at an angle towards the sky where the sun is. And then as the sun moves it up and overhead and down to the west, it follows in one axis, horizontal axis. It rotates to face the sun as it goes through south to southwest to west. And in the other axis, it tilts higher in the sky and then lower in the sky to follow.
Wow.
So those are the two axes. The two-axis tracker adds a lot of value here. If you go down to the equator where the sun goes straight up from the east and over top and down to the west, a two-axis tracker means nothing. You use one axis and just follow the sun.
Right.
So
right.
The farther north you are, the more advantage it has. And these devices have a lot of value when you get up into the Arctic.
It's kind of like a sunflower, I guess. They kind of, focus at the sun, and then
that's a very good analogy. That's exactly right. Except their evolution has taught them to do it without mechanics and hydraulics and so on. But yeah, that's a very good analogy.
Very smart.
That's what they're doing.
So you're an inspiration, to a lot. And what is your driving force behind becoming an energy advocate? Are you part of different boards or committees to help spread the word in many ways?
Well, driving force is probably just a personal passion for doing it. And it leads me to be involved in different groups and different boards. I'm part of the board of the Electric Vehicle Association, EVAC. Mm-hmm. And I'm working with a consultant on a pro bono basis so far that's looking at chargers in condos, because that's in multi-unit residentials, that's a very big problem. And there's some amazingly good solutions, it turns out, but people haven't got very far in getting their heads around them yet. So I know when I started out getting involved with solar and so on, I thought, and condos are somebody else's problem because I live out in a rural area where we don't have condos. But I managed to start talking to somebody who's working on that project, and that's become another passion of mine. So yeah, I tend to get involved in helping people out. EV chargers, small sites like small municipalities and private companies want one or two or three chargers. They really don't know where to start. So I do a lot of just spending time on emails and phone calls and saying, here's what you need to think about, and here's who you could talk to, and here's who could help you out. It's really a teaching process and a learning and a kind of whole leading people in the right direction.
Well, and speaking about that, you really have to probably maintain a really good balanced view, because you have to wonder where the source is of these articles that are being written. Some of them could be propaganda, or, there's a hidden meaning. So where do you source your information to maintain that balanced view?
That's a challenge. And I've got a few bits of advice I give people, but I also have a list of which I could give you if you want to post it. There's a few groups like Bloomberg New Energy Finance and like the Electrical Vehicle Association locally, and the National Electric Vehicle Association has a really good series of webinars that are available on YouTube that people can go and watch on a lot of those technologies. Clean Energy Canada has a newsletter that I always follow. Another one is Electric Autonomy, publishes a newsletter every week that has some really good information. So these kind of things keep you advised of what's changing and what's new and what's expected to change. When you start hearing conflicting stories, and I probably don't need to get into great specifics, but hydrogen is one where people have a lot of disagreement on hydrogen, and it's mandatory and it's going to be part of the world, but never in transport. And so there's people who are very wise and knowledgeable on that. People like Michael Liebreich, who created New Energy Finance and then sold it. He's living in England. A fellow named, is it Michael Bernard, a chemist who actually lives in Vancouver, who talks about a lot of this stuff and about pipelines, which are high voltage transmission lines that connect electricity grids around the world, which is a new growing technology. There's a few gurus that you can follow, and they will give you a lot of good ideas. And then I think the final answer is when you hear something that seems to conflict with other things, dig farther, look at where the money's coming from, look at who they're representing,
Right.
and look at why they're in conflict with everybody else.
Yeah.
For example, we've gone through, we're pretty well past now on the electric vehicle side, the story of, oh yeah, electric vehicles take so much carbon to make that they're worse than gas vehicles. And that myth has been pretty well dispelled, but you do have to listen and figure out why are they still saying that, what data are they using, and so on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you have to be pretty discriminate.
Yeah, it's a skill for sure. You really have to find the source, I guess.
Yeah, find the source, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of, being an energy advocate, and it's about shifting attitudes. It's mindsets, and it's, driving an electric vehicle, you have to have a different attitude toward that because there's no gas station every 5 minutes, where you go. And so you have to drive a little differently. It's shifting attitudes in that way. Well, how do you mitigate opposition and pushback?
You don't. You don't. It's a teaching process. And for example, it'll be 5 years this month since I got my Tesla. And why did I get a Tesla? Well, it was sort of cool to have, but more because there was nothing else to have. If you wanted to get into electric vehicles, there were very limited choices. And it was the only one that had the range that I needed because I live over 100 kilometers away from the nearest city. Mm-hmm. So I showed this to my neighbor next door who commuted every day into Halifax. And I said, you could save yourself thousands of dollars a year if you bought this right from day one. And he looked at it and he said, I'm not ready for that yet.
Right.
And so, yeah, it's shifting attitudes, but some people's attitudes shift faster than others. And you have to accept that.
Yes.
So I tend to preach to people when I can, but back off if they're not really listening, because you're not going to gain anything, and just try to help the ones that do need help. And my help is generally some conceptual, but a lot of more technological, because I'm an electrical engineer by background, and I sort of understand the physics behind this stuff and the technology. So that's kind of where I get more involved.
Yeah. And I love that, how you have your professional background that you can apply, and that's probably what, how you geek out on this stuff too, I imagine.
Yeah. So like some other people have said, go to school, don't do the background work so that you can understand this stuff, and you'll have a long and a happy life.
Right. What would you say to someone who may be frustrated, with how slow the energy transition is moving? The world, we were talking earlier, you say the world is 5 years into a 50-year experiment.
Yeah, it's an experiment. We're talking about being net zero by 2050.
Right.
And I'm an old person, but I said I have to live till 2050 because I got to see whether we win or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's an experiment. I think you have to say that people need to be generous, and we're trying to do things, and a lot of people are going to make mistakes with the best of intentions, because the data we have is not perfect and the history is very limited. So allow them the right to have, in good faith, tried something, it didn't work, and go back and try something else, and don't jump on governments and don't jump on companies and complain and put them down because they didn't do exactly the right thing. We'll get there, and it needs everybody to be working positively and collaboratively to make it happen.
Excellent. What is next for you?
Good question. I think as the 5 years have gone by since I really got into this, or maybe it's more than 5 years, some of the basics have been sorted out. Like our Electric Vehicle Association started out just trying to tell people about electric cars, and now I'm more into the larger scale issues to do with electric vehicle chargers and helping people, for example, in the condos, as I mentioned, looking at getting people to think about electric vehicles in a 30-year time frame, because we're bragging now that, and it's quite amazing that the sale of electric vehicles in the world hit 20%. And the sale of electric vehicles in China is 38% in the last month in Europe, and we're way behind. But if the sale of electric vehicles were 100%, if every vehicle sold was electric, vehicles on the road take 15 years to replace, because that's how long they last. So we're going to have gas vehicles around for a long time. So right. I don't need people to think in those sort of terms. If you're thinking of putting charging into condos, for example, in probably 20 years, only half the vehicles on the road and therefore half the vehicles in the condos are going to be electric. So that's the kind of speed at which you need to make that happen. And those things people don't think about very often. So that's kind of more the longer term that I've started to get into.
Yeah. Interesting. Never would have thought about that, but you're right. The gas vehicles, there'll be a mixture for many years.
Yeah. So, we wrote, I and another fellow have written a white paper that we sent to NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, which has a zero emissions vehicle program for funding chargers. And they've got they explain we're stuck with what we have till 2026, because by the time you get government legislation through to provide this funding and you write the rules for it, you can't just go back and say, oh, now I want to change them. So we're working at talking about what they need to do in the next round, which will be 2026. So those are the kind of time frames that we have to think about as we make this whole thing happen. And then today, for example, yesterday we heard from Tory Rushton that they're abandoning the Atlantic Loop connection between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and Quebec and Labrador for power, and they're going to do something different. So that means you got to start thinking, okay, if I want to help to promote getting clean energy into the province, that changes the direction somewhat. So who should you talk to? What companies should you send little notes to saying, hey, you guys should talk to each other? I find a lot of what I do is getting people to talk to each other and then stepping back and letting them do it. It's a very productive way to get things to happen at a larger scale than I have any resources or skill sets to do. But you get a battery company and an electric solar panel company and electric vehicle charger company together and get them doing something, and they can make things happen that I could never dream of. Right. They don't know about each other, so you got to get them connected.
And that is what I'm learning a lot through this podcast. It's going to take a lot of partnerships and collaborating or collaborations. It's going to be it can't be a solo project. It's got to be everybody taking.
Yeah, and a pat on the back to you, Maria, because I follow your podcast and you talk to people at very diverse parts of the world. For example, the person who talked about educating children, and
yes,
that's so important, right? Amazing. When I drive my Tesla down or stop somewhere with my Tesla, I have the elderly people like me who are in my 70s and say, what company makes Tesla? And the kids all say, that's a Tesla. Can I sit in it?
Well, it's funny because when we first got our car, and we were shortly after when you got yours, it was the kids that knew what a Tesla was, and the parents were like, oh,
so when anybody wants to write off the kids for next future generations, no, the kids are wise, and the kids will be our saviors. So we have to educate the kids. That's one thing I think about all the time.
Thank you, Stephen, for joining me today. It was a pleasure talking to you. And I really wish you well. Keep going on the journey that you're going on and continue to be an inspiration to others.
Thank you very much. And keep on doing what you're doing too, Maria. I appreciate the opportunity.
That was Stephen Mildenberger, a renewable energy and EV advocate who I hope inspires you to rethink your reliance on the grid. This podcast is sponsored by the smart people behind the Smart Energy event. It's held in Halifax each spring. Make sure you register. I'm your host, Maria McGowan. Thanks for tuning in.